When you think of a park, you might think of picnics and walking dogs, playing frisbee or flying kites. Now what you probably don't think of is toxic chemicals and coal power plants. I mean, let me know if you do, but that's just not the most common response. I'm at Gasworks Park in Seattle, and this is a place where coal power plants and recreational areas combine. And it's not hard to see why it's been named one of the strangest in the world. Now, it's an unusual mix, there's no doubt about that. And it looks very beautiful above the ground, but below is still a toxic legacy that's been around for decades. In fact, the waterfront just here still can't be used for kayaking, for fishing to this very day. Seattle as a city has a lot of parks. There are, according to their website, over 489 parks and natural areas. Now, over 489 is a pretty weird thing to say, so let's say they've got 490. Now, these vary from beachside parks to the massive 500-acre Discovery Park, as well as smaller dog-off-lead areas. Now, it's worth remembering that city parks don't happen by accident. Cities have got to decide that these are either things worth valuing and preserving or creating them from scratch. In 1903, Seattle had just 5 major parks, or maybe they would have said over 4, but they had a vision for something more. Now, there was momentum from a newspaper article called "Let Us Make a Beautiful City of Seattle," and that outlined a proposal for the city to acquire land and create this elaborate series of parks. Now, the folks who did this work were the Olmsted brothers, and that was a landscape architecture firm led by John Charles Olmsted, who was the stepson of Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a conservationist, and he's been named the father of landscape architecture. Now, they designed and preserved just an insane number of urban parks. Here's a montage. The team came up with something impressive that would change Seattle forever, maybe even more so than the Fremont Troll. So in their broadly adopted comprehensive plan, they said that this area here should become a park. And it did not really. It became the furthest thing away from a park initially. This was a coal gasification plant, and it creates synthetic gas, or syn-gas, out of superheated coal. And it's just as toxic and polluting as you might expect. Now, the way it works is you heat coal to a very high temperature in sealed ovens. And because it's deprived from oxygen, the gases that were produced were known as town gas. And that includes hydrogen and methane and carbon monoxide. Now, this gas burns cleaner and hotter and brighter than the coal itself, so it was used a lot in heating and lighting. Now, these facilities and plants were incredibly common at the time. They're in towns and cities across the country. This particular one was operated by the Seattle Gas Light Company, and it was a process that used a lot of water. And that explains its location right here by the lake. Now, the air pollution that comes from these plants is just insane, and it makes you a pretty unpleasant neighbour. And all up, syn-gas was kind of short-lived. Seattle moved to hydropower as its main source of electricity, and natural gas also displaced it. So this plant was shut down, which was welcome news to the neighbours, who had been complaining about the air and water pollution for decades. So Seattle had to answer the question, what do we do with this site? Because at the time it was not pretty. Now, the man who got the job to transform it described it at the time as a derelict, obsolescent, dump heap industrial wasteland. As a quick aside, Seattle's one of the most expensive cities in the world, so I'm sure that even if you found an apartment described like that, it still wouldn't be cheap. So despite it being in awful condition, its location and views of the lake made the park idea still a valid one over half a century later. With that as the way forward, you've still got an entire industrial plant to rip down and dispose of. One landscape architect, Richard Haag, had a totally different vision. Now, he saw beauty in all of this, as well as having an important history to preserve, describing these buildings as family, kind of like that uncle you've got who turns coal into synthetic gas, just like that. In fact, just to show you how rare his thinking was, he submitted this site as a design problem for a national undergrad design competition to see what their students would come up with. And every single one of them, around 130 designs, removed any indication that this gas plant was ever here. Now, I don't think he was outsourcing his work to students, but it does show his unusual approach. So to achieve this, he spent the next few years convincing the local community and getting them not just happy, but excited about the idea of preserving these buildings. Now, the other incredible challenge was the soil, because after decades of processing toxic chemicals, the soil here was a mess. And one historian said it had char bubbling up, it had oil spills all over it, so it was fairly ugly to a lot of people's eyes. And yeah, I would agree, bubbling oil spills does count as fairly ugly. So by now the soil contained a lot of sulfur, arsenic, coal tar, and a lot of other byproducts that had leaked into the soil. Again, the go-to position would be to just dig it all out and take it away. But not our man Richard Haag. Now, he was an early pioneer of a process called bioremediation. And that's using things like sawdust and biosolids and remedying the soil without removing it. And that includes using oil-degrading enzymes and organic matter to break down the toxic materials. Now, this was an unusual approach at the time, but Haag got his way and the processes were being implemented and work got underway. It's worth saying that not everyone loved the design. In fact, this park was originally going to be named the Myrtle Edwards Park, after the councilwoman who really spearheaded acquiring this land and who'd passed away in a car accident. Now, her family actually asked that her name be taken off because of how much of this industrial equipment is still here. Instead, there's another park in Seattle that bears her name. So after a lot of work and remediation, the park was opened in 1975. And as for the park itself today, there's a beautiful beachfront to Lake Union. Much of the plant stands as ruins, while some's been painted and turned into a play barn for the kids. There's an artificial kite flying hill, which has been home to a sundial on the summit, and it's been described by the Seattle Times as easily the strangest park in Seattle, and may rank amongst the strangest in the world. And the park is used for a bunch of stuff. Concerts, protests, 4th of July events, this scene from 10 Things I Hate About You, and even the world naked bike rides. It's become a beloved part of the city. So you might wonder, how clean is the park now? Well, firstly, the water area in Lake Union is off limits for swimming, fishing and launching boats. Now, the main issue is stirring up sediment, because there would be a risk with long-term chronic exposure. Now, you're not going to get immediate blisters and burns if you touch it, but as the senior planner for Seattle Park said, you would want to wash it off. Now, as for the soil, it's been an imperfect process. In the 1980s, the US Environmental Protection Agency required additional measures that included capping waste and groundwater remediation to stop any benzene from reaching Lake Union. Through 2000 and 2006, there were further environmental cleanups, and that included adding 2 feet of topsoil for safety and environmental reasons. Similarly, in 2014, Kite Hill was closed after testing found contamination, and that also had topsoil added. I always get a funny feeling when governments do stuff like that, because of course it's the right thing to do, but the question stands, has this been unsafe for the last few decades? The fact is, turning a waste site into a clean, safe area for families is no easy task. And it's been years after this factory shut down, but it still has an impact to the quality and its use of this area. That's why it's definitely worth considering this stuff when you're building plants that use chemicals, radioactive and hazardous materials. So all that being said, I think it's a pretty special site and well worth a look. So I recommend if you are in Seattle, come down past the troll and have a look. And as for the safety, a local news report said you got nothing to worry about safety-wise for an average visitor. Just don't eat the dirt. If you enjoyed this, I'm continuing my journey across America, so please do subscribe to check out more. From this industrial wasteland, I'm Julian O'Shea.